So imagine you're looking at a fortress. But it's not just any fortress. It's suspended hundreds of feet in the sky, literally rising straight out of the New Mexican desert.
Right, just a sheer sandstone mesa.
Exactly. It's Acoma Pueblo, famously known as Sky City. And, logically, when you hold a towering high ground like that, defended by 1,000 warriors, you'd expect to be completely untouchable. You pull up the ladders and, well, you're perfectly secure.
You would think so. It creates this powerful illusion of geographic invincibility. But in 1599, that fortress fell to an invading force of just 70 men.
Which is just staggering. And welcome to today's deep dive, everyone. We are looking into the massive stack of sources on the 1599 Acoma Massacre. And we've got everything from historical archives to video essays and even a pitch for a Gothic flamenco vampire musical.
Yeah, that last one is definitely a fascinating lens on the history.
Oh, it's wild. But our mission today isn't just to, recount the timeline of a battle. We want to understand the clash of these two completely different civilizations, the really dark psychology of colonial warfare, and how this specific trauma is literally still echoing today.
Right. And to understand the sheer scale of this collision, we have to set the stage in the late 1500s. The Spanish crown is pushing aggressively to expand New Spain northward.
Into what we now know as New Mexico.
Exactly. So in 1595, Juan de Oñate gets permission to colonize the area. But he doesn't just march up with a military vanguard. He brings an entire mobile society. We're talking 500 colonists and an estimated 7,000 head of livestock.
Okay, let's unpack this. 7,000 livestock and 500 people moving into a desert area already populated by the Pueblo peoples. How did the Acoma initially react to this massive intrusion?
Well, at first it was deeply uneasy caution. But by 1598, that caution turned into outright alarm. Zutacapan, who was the Acoma spiritual leader, learned that the Spanish didn't just want land or trade.
They wanted a total overhaul of the society.
Right. They planned a complete cultural erasure, primarily forcing the Acoma into the encomienda system.
And encomienda is one of those terms that gets glossed over as just, slavery, but it's really more like a forced protection racket, right?
That's a good way to describe it. The Spanish crown granted colonizers the right to demand forced labor and tribute, so food, blankets, things like that, in exchange for supposedly protecting the indigenous people and forcing them to convert to Catholicism.
Which for the Acoma meant losing their spiritual practices, their homes, basically everything. It was an existential threat. So Zutacapan knows they have to resist. But here's the thing. Despite having a massive numerical advantage, the Acoma drastically miscalculated the Spanish military threat.
They did. And one of the historical analysis videos we looked at brought up this really fascinating theory about mock battles.
Oh, right. This blew my mind.
Yeah, so the Acoma had supposedly been watching Spanish soldiers perform these celebratory plays about the Reconquista from a distance.
Like historical reenactments.
Exactly. And during these mock battles, the soldiers would shoot each other with blanks. There would be all this loud smoke and thunder, and the men would fall down playing dead. But then, when the scene was over, they'd just get right back up.
Wait, really? So the Acomas were watching from the cliffs, and they see these guys shoot each other, and then the dead guys just come back to life.
Right. So the theory is that the Acoma mistakenly believed Spanish firearms were just harmless, loud props. Just fear tactics.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. If they thought the guns were fake, they fought back thinking they had a massive tactical advantage. It's like watching a movie being filmed and thinking the stuntmen are actually invincible. Did that psychological disconnect doom them?
It certainly played a huge role. Cultural misunderstandings often act as an accelerant to violence.
Yeah.
The Acoma believed they could handle a skirmish because they completely underestimated the enemy's firepower.
And that skirmish finally erupts on December 4th, 1598. Oñate's nephew, Juan de Zaldivar, arrives with just 16 men. They're demanding food and winter blankets.
Which the Acoma, knowing the encomienda threat, absolutely refuse.
Naturally. And the Spanish reaction is horrifying. When they're refused, they just invade the homes. And they didn't just take food, they assaulted the Keres women.
Yes, leaving them stripped and humiliated in front of their children. It was a profound violation.
I mean, it's horrific. And obviously, the Acoma retaliates immediately. They end up killing Juan de Zaldivar and 11 of his men in the chaos.
Right, which creates a massive strategic crisis for Oñate. He knows that if word spreads to the 50 other pueblos that the Acoma successfully killed a Spanish commander, his entire colony would be wiped out.
So it connects directly to the retaliation. Oñate sends Juan's brother, Vicente de Zaldivar, with 70 men to punish the Acoma in January 1599.
And for the first 2 days of the siege, the Acoma's geographical advantage actually works. Being atop that sheer mesa, they easily hold off the Spanish. They were throwing rocks, jeering at them.
But then comes day 3. And this is where the technological asymmetry just becomes devastating. The Spanish haul a small cannon up the side of the mesa.
Yeah, and you have to think about the physics here. Acoma is built with traditional adobe. It's great against arrows, but when you fire a solid iron cannonball into sun-baked mud at close range,
It just disintegrates.
worse than that, it explodes. It creates spalling. The adobe turns into deadly shrapnel.
Imagine holding the high ground in a snowball fight, completely untouchable, and suddenly your opponent pulls out a flamethrower. That cannon wasn't just a weapon, it was an apocalyptic event for Sky City.
And it was designed to be. The Spanish relied on that kind of technological terror to break the morale of a numerically superior force. We are talking 4,000 Acoma against 70 Spaniards.
The carnage is just unspeakable. Around 800 Acoma are killed, including 300 women and children.
The physical battle ends there, but the psychological warfare was really just beginning. Oñate took about 500 survivors prisoner and handed down these unbelievably cruel sentences.
Yeah, let's talk about the aftermath, because this is where the psychology of vengeance gets really dark. Oñate sentenced all males between 12 and 25, and all females over 12 to 20 years of slavery.
He also took 60 young women, tore them from their families, and sent them to convents in Mexico City.
And then there were the mutilations. 2 Hopi prisoners who just happened to be there had their hands cut off and were sent away as living warnings. But the most notorious punishment was for the 24 Acoma men over the age of 25.
Right. They were sentenced to have their right foot amputated. Although, you should note, there is an alternative historical interpretation in the sources we reviewed.
Oh, the debate over the translation.
Exactly. The toes versus foot debate. Some historians argue that the original Spanish records say las puntas del pie, which means the points of the foot, or the toes.
Right, the argument being that the Spanish wouldn't destroy a slave's usefulness by taking the whole foot, since they were sentenced to hard labor.
Exactly. We're just reporting what the historical analysis points out here. But proponents of this theory argue that taking the toes inflicts permanent agony and a limp, but keeps the person as a viable laborer.
Either way, toes or whole foot, it's calculated state-sanctioned mutilation. Where does Oñate even get the mindset to order something like this?
Well, the sources trace it back to his military background. Oñate grew up fighting the Chichimeca rebellions in Mexico. It was a brutal guerrilla war, and he learned that against a massive indigenous population, you use overwhelming psychological terror.
So he thought he was preventing a wider uprising.
Right. The amputations were allegedly an old Spanish or Moorish tactic. You physically mark defeated foes so they can never fight again, and they serve as permanent visual deterrents.
So what does this all mean? Oñate thought he was stopping a wider war, but does calculated brutality actually secure peace, or does it just guarantee that the resentment boils over later?
Well, history gives us an answer. Even King Philip III of Spain eventually found Oñate's cruelty excessive. He actually banished him from New Mexico in disgrace.
Wow. So the cruelty even alienated his own king.
Exactly. And it certainly didn't break the Acoma. In fact, their resilience following this is incredible.
Yeah, let's talk about the cultural echoes, because the Acoma story doesn't end in 1599. They were actually forced to build the Spanish San Esteban del Rey mission right there on the mesa.
Right, and to do that, they had to drag massive ponderosa pine timbers from Mount Taylor, which is 40 miles away.
40 miles, dragging massive logs across the desert to build a church for the people who just massacred them. But even with that, by 1601, the Acoma were already rebuilding. And today, Sky City is the oldest continuously inhabited community in North America.
It really is a testament to their endurance. And the legacy of 1599 is still very much a live wire in modern politics.
Absolutely. The sources touch on these modern protests, and it's fascinating to see how the physical monuments of this history are treated today. In 1998, Acoma protesters actually cut the right foot off an Oñate statue in New Mexico.
Yeah, they left a note saying it was on behalf of their brothers and sisters of Acoma Pueblo.
And then, during the nationwide protests in 2020, multiple Oñate statues were actually removed by officials for safekeeping after violence erupted. We are obviously not taking a political side on statue removals here, but it just shows how raw that 400-year-old wound still is.
Exactly. It's a living history.
Yeah.
And marginalized groups process that trauma in lots of different ways, which brings us to the most surprising source in our stack.
Yes. Okay, I was so eager to get to this. We read a pitch for a supernatural musical horror series called Legends of the Southwest.
It is quite the tonal shift.
It really is. It reimagines the Acoma Massacre through this character named Lucas, who is a two-spirit native person. Lucas joins up with these LGBTQ-friendly flamenco vampires to take blood-soaked vengeance on the Spanish soldiers.
It's a very stylized approach.
Honestly, it's like Inglourious Basterds meets Hamilton.
Yeah.
It's taking historical trauma and using this hyper-stylized supernatural art to reclaim power.
And that's actually a very common sociological tool. Marginalized groups often use genre fiction, whether it's horror or fantasy, to process historical atrocities. It allows them to rewrite narratives of victimization into narratives of empowerment.
Right, they get to control the narrative on their own terms.
Exactly.
So bringing it all together, you can really see how the Acoma Massacre isn't just some dusty date in a textbook. It is a living memory. Whether it's the 5,000 Acoma people alive today, or the empty pedestals where those statues used to stand, or, fictional vampires dancing flamenco to reclaim their history, this event continues to shape the physical and cultural landscape of the American Southwest.
It does. And I want to leave you with one last thing to ponder, something we haven't touched on yet.
Oh, what's that?
We focus so much on the Spanish breaking the Acoma's physical defenses with that cannon. We look at how the Mesa failed them militarily. But think about this. What if the very isolation of Sky City, living on top of that barren, sheer cliff, is the exact same geographical isolation that protected their indigenous language and culture from being completely assimilated over the next 400 years?
Oh, wow.
Did the Mesa fail as a military fort only to succeed as a cultural vault?
That is an incredible thought.
Yeah.
The physical walls fell, but the cultural walls held strong. Definitely something for you to mull over. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, and we'll catch you next time.